In this video I'm going to talk about box sizing and the most common CSS units. So let's get started. I'm going to create 3 boxes with a class of box. I'm going to put some lorem ipsum in each of these boxes. Lorem, and then I'm going to style that. The class is box, display. I'm going to make it an inline block because I want the 3 boxes to be in a row, and the width is going to be 30% because I want it to take up less than 1/3 of the width, so there's still some room for spacing and margin. Border, I'm going to make that 1px solid #333 and margin 1%. So that's it. So we've got 3 columns now. At the moment the text is jammed right up against the side of the box on each of the boxes. What I'd like to do is give it some padding so the text moves, so there's a bit of space between the side of the box and the text. So I'm going to give it the padding of 10px. That wasn't quite what I wanted to happen. The box has moved to the next line. This is because the box itself has increased in size, but I wanted it to stay the same size and the text to shrink in width. I can get over this problem by changing the box sizing property. Let me show you. I'm going to create a wildcard. A wildcard lets you set all the elements everywhere. And I'm going to do box sizing and border box. And now I've got what I wanted. That's because with border box, instead of the box expanding, the box remains the same size. The text becomes narrower. What you have by default is content box. So if I put it back to content box, it goes back to the way it was. So I'll put it back to border box. Here we have a slide showing this happening. On the first box it says it's content box and the width is 30% plus 10 pixels left padding and 10 pixels right padding, whereas on the border box the width of the box is as it was set at 30% and it stays at 30%, and padding reduces the size of the text by 10px on the left and 10 pixels on the right. The next thing I want to talk about is CSS units. In CSS you have absolute units like pixels and relative units like rem and ems. A pixel is just a dot on the screen. It is always a dot on the screen. It is not relative to anything else on the web page. That's why it's an absolute value. Relative values are either dependent on the values set in the parent element or values set in the root element. which is the HTML element. If you're declaring a font size, you probably want to go with rem. Rem and em are relative units, but rem is relative to the root element, whereas the em is relative to its parent element. An example will show you what I mean. I'll delete this. And this. Create a div with a class container. And inside that I'm going to create a rem block, and then h1 with rem, and then p tag and some lorem ipsum in it, and then below here create a m class block, and h1, and this is m, and then p again with some more lorem ipsum. Okay, so we've got that. So now on the styles, I'll start with the container class. Container, this is the one that surrounds everything. And so dot container, and display I'm going to use flex, and flex direction is row. Okay, so that puts it into 2 columns, and then gap 20 pixels. So that gives us a gap. So next I'm going to create .em. I'm not going to put anything in there just yet. And then .em h1, set the font size to 2.5 em, and .em space p. This will select the p in the em class. So that's font size 1 em. So if I go back to the index where I've set the em, then h1, that's em h1 here, and then em p tag, that will be the em p tag here. In a similar way, I can select .rem h1. I'll give that a font size of 2.5 em, and .rem p, I'll give that a font size rem, that should be font size of 1 rem. They both look the same at the moment. That's because on the em, the default on the root element is 16 pixels. and because there's nothing in the .em class, because I haven't set the font size, it'll inherit it from the root element, so that'll be 16 pixels as well. And then the font size of the EM will be 2.5 times the EM class, which is 16 pixels. So it's 2.5 times 16 pixels. So it'd be about 62 pixels for the EM. And the H1 on the rem, it takes his size from the root element, which is by default 16 pixels. So that too will be 62 pixels. And the P element is just 16 pixels, because the root element is 16 pixels. Same as the P element on the EM is 16 pixels. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a font size of 2em, and the lettering got incredibly big. That's because it inherits 16 pixels from the root element and then multiplies it by 2 to get 32 pixels. And then you have 2.5 times what it inherited from here, which is 32 pixels times 2.5, which is 80 pixels. And the P tag is 1em, so this is comes to 32 pixels, so it's 32 pixels times 1, so this text is 32 pixels. Now, what do you think will happen if I create .rem class and make that a font size of 2rem rather? It stays the same. That's because putting 2rem as the font size on the .rem class doesn't make any difference, because these rem values take their value from the root element, the HTML element, which defaults to 16 pixels. And so this is still 2.5 times 16 pixels, which is 62 pixels, and this is still 16 pixels. If I comment this out and comment this out, they go back to being the same size. Now, if I go HTML and then set a font size on the HTML of 2rem, they both get bigger. This is because they're taking their size from the root element, which I've just made 2rem. I've made it 32 pixels, so they're both inheriting 32 pixels from the HTML element, which is the root element. I'll delete this. So with ems, font sizes can become very large. Rems were created to overcome this problem with ems, and nowadays it is normally best to use rems when setting the font sizes. Ems are good on margins and padding in places where if you increase the size of the parent and you want everything on the child to increase proportionately. As an example, I'm going to create some buttons. create a container class and call it buttons, and then button dot btn. I'll call that button 1. And this will be btn small. I'll call that button 2. This will be btn large. I'll call that button 3. I'll style the buttons dot btn for the first button, and then padding, I'm going to make this 0.75 em for the height and 2.25 em for the width, and border is none, margin is 0.1 em, and cursor is pointer, and font weight is bold, and background color is F5, F5, F5. So now I have padding and margin set with ems, and ems work slightly different with margin and padding and other properties that aren't font size. The way they are different is that they don't just inherit from their parent, they also inherit from their own element. So if I create a font size here, 1 em, it gets slightly bigger, and everything gets bigger, not just the font size but also the margin and padding as well. Also, if I make that bigger still, make it 1.5 em, it gets even bigger, you see, and the third button is wrapping onto the next line. If I make it 0.5 em, I get smaller buttons. The font size is smaller, and so is the margin and the padding. But the thing is, the proportions remain the same. I'll delete that. So for the btn small button, I can just change the font size. I'll make that 0.5 em. So now I've got a small button there for button 2, and the margin and padding has got proportionately smaller. Button large, font size 1.5 em. So now I've got a large button on the end, and the margin and padding is proportionately larger. Of course, having proportional margin means that the gap here for the margin on button 3 is larger than it is here. But it may be that you want these gaps to be the same, in which case you could set the margin here to 20px. And now the margin on all the buttons is the same, and so are the gaps. The next thing I want to talk about is percentages. Percentages are useful with the width and height properties, percentage has to be a percentage of something, and in the case of CSS elements, it is a percentage of the parent element. I'm going to create a box. I'll create a div with a class of .box in it, and then in styles I'll .box. I'll give it background color of pink. Nothing shows up. It will only show up if either I put something that already has height, like text, or I give it height. So I'll give it some text. Just put some text. Now I get the pink color. Height is the same height as the text, and the width is 100% because a width of 100% is the default for a div element. So if I delete this, I get nothing again. If I go here, I put height 100 pixels, and I get the square box again of a height of 100 pixels. If I set the height to 5%, what do you think will happen? I get nothing. Why is that? It's because it looks at the height of the parent element, and the parent element in this case is the body element. The body element has not been set, and by default its height is 0. So if I set the height of the body element to 100%, will that fix the problem? Well, let's see. Body and height 100%. No, it doesn't. Why is that? Well, the body element is 100% of its parent element, which is the HTML element, and has not been set and defaults to 0. And so the body is 100% of 0, which is 0, and the div with the class of box is 5% of 0, which is also 0, and so nothing shows because the height is 0. So what if I set the HTML element to 100% as well? Will it work then? Well, let's see. HTML, and we get it. It works. How come? Well, the HTML has no parent element, so when I set it to 100%, it references to the viewport height value, which is equal to the viewport height. So the HTML element and the body element in our code is 100% of the viewport height, and the div with the class box has a height of 5% of the body, which means its height is 5% of the viewport height, which is what you get here. If I go to the box class and I set the width to 50%, it's only half the size. If I set it to 25%, it's only a quarter of the width. And if I set it to 75%, it's 3/4 of the width. I'm going to leave it at 50%. And I'm going to create another box inside this div. I'm going to give it a class of sub box. Then I'm going to sub box, and I'll give that a height of 5%, width 100%, and ground color of sky blue. I can just see it along there. It's a very thin line. That's because the height here is 5% of the viewport area, and the sub box is 5% of the 5%, which makes it 1/4%, or 0.25%. So if I make this height here on the sub box 50%, now it takes up half of this, because it's 50% of the 5% of the parent, which is the box. And so this is 5% of the viewport area, and this will be 50% of 5%, which is 2.5% of the viewport area. The width is 100% of its parent, which is the box, and the box is 50% of the viewport area. Most of the time you will not need to set a height. Normally the things you put on the web page wrap and fill the page in a natural way, and if you can, it's best to let them do that. That's probably enough for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe for more.